Okay, this is Matthew Cheung, CEO of ipushpull, and in the podcast, the Capital Markets Forum podcast today, we're delighted to be joined by Eren Erman, who's Head of Compliance Technology. Thanks for joining us, Eren.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
So, could we do a deep dive into, well, a limited deep dive into compliance technology and some of the trends that we're seeing, some of the innovations that you're kind of seeing, and how that's applied, particularly into a large interdealer broker like TP ICAP?
Sure. Compliance technology, RegTech, as we all know, is growing space. A lot of vendors are entering it to support and provide solutions to govern communication. But that's not the only use case. We could spend an hour on all the use cases, but I'll focus probably on record keeping, so voice and e-coms as a focus for this conversation, if that's all right. So no surprise, channels are growing. People are communicating using the standard classic voice channels and e-communication channels written. So things like Bloomberg chat, ICE chat, or voice turrets, Cloud9. But there is evolving channels, social media, and social applications like WhatsApp. Again, people are communicating. We've seen a lot of fines behind that, specifically in the US, but that doesn't mean that it should preclude you from being able to use it as long as it's governed. So I'd say in a nutshell, the first trend is how do you ensure that you can evolve your communication channels, govern it, and make sure it's recorded, archived correctly, and you train your traders or brokers to be able to use those channels within policy. I'd say another thing too is just on the voice, we're seeing transcription as an evolving trend. It's technology is becoming more prevalent and available. I'd say transcription is becoming even more commoditized. Vendors like OpenAI offering large language models as open source can allow most vendors to tap into it free of charge or limited charge, but the ability to transcribe voices is now available. I think regulators globally are looking at that as a use case, and I think the expectation is there already. Definitely in the financial services space, I think it's evolving in other sectors like energy and commodities, but that's evolving, and how you use transcription to proactively transcribe voice, ingest that into your communication monitoring system, and then monitor that proactively as well.
Is that transcription technology particularly accurate? Because over time, in the last few years, it's been an area where it's not been fantastic, but presumably large language models are helping the accuracy of that data. But then how do you find the different syntax and nomenclature that different desks have and the accuracy of those transcriptions?
So to answer your question, the accuracy depends on the language. I think English has a better starting point, but as you get in other languages, no surprise, it gets more complicated. That being said, though, there's two parts of the transcription journey. There's the first mile transcription, which is what you're talking about, word error rates, how accurate can it transcribe the actual voice. But that's the first mile, and I'd say that's more commoditized, e.g. it's more available and more vendors can use it and produce it and make it available to their customers. But the last mile is where the magic happens in terms of the policies within the surveillance platforms to identify patterns. You can use basic lexicons, which are binary words, to identify and match to voice transcription. But there's AI and policies that are, they're still scaling across the vendor landscape, but that aligns to more looking at combinations of words or patterns of words and finding behaviors that might not have been found on just monitoring individual words or combinations of words. So it depends on the vendor who's built the policies, how the customers built their policies on top in terms of what they're monitoring for and the technology they're using, e.g. AI, that can find more patterns that the needle in the haystack classic example.
And is compliance generally T+1, or do you do any real-time monitoring as well?
For
In general?
Well, in ecoms, yeah, we're real-time monitoring, and it flags alerts as conversations are happening. So yeah.
And what do you define as e-coms? Because that might not be a general term
Sure.
for people outside
E-communications,
of compliance.
electronic communications, it's anything written. So email or anything that's written on in written format. So could be an SMS text message, could be a Teams chat message, anything that's written where you type into a keyboard and produce a record, electronic record, a word. Whereas voice is when you talk. So you can be on WhatsApp voice, you can be on Cloud9, a BT turret.
So you mentioned about banks getting fined rather for poor record keeping or using platforms that are kind of shadow IT essentially and not being monitored. In some industries, they may not be as regulated as, say, like the financial industry, like energy or crypto, for example. What approach does someone like TP ICAP take when you're having to cover different industries with different levels of regulation? Do you see them all with the highest level of um, record keeping and information that you're gathering, regardless of what the regulator sees it as? How do you kind of approach that?
Well, I guess to start, we monitor our employees, but we're not monitoring employees of our customers. That's their responsibility from a regulation perspective. So I can't really comment on how our customers are monitoring. I would expect that they're doing at least the minimums that they're required. I think if you're regulated like we are, you'd expect that they would have the same governance over monitoring of communications. But for those that aren't regulated, and you mentioned energy and commodities, that's an example. It's a decision how they decide to monitor, because they are speaking to regulated brokers like TP ICAP, and we are recording everything. They may not, but their policies, it starts with their policies, what you can and can't do, and then they decide if they want to be proactive in terms of recording or not. I think there's a trend evolving in the energy and commodity space, as an example, that they are looking at recording more proactively, for example, WhatsApp, or looking at voice transcription as another use case. I'd probably say the same for asset managers, hedge funds. With the SEC and CFTC fines, their targets on their head. So everyone's looking at this, and when you talk to the vendors, there are definitely those verticals all looking at how they can better govern their communication channels, if they're regulated or not.
So do you, as a compliance person, still have the same level of comfort that you do with, say, WhatsApp compared to, say, a Bloomberg chat?
So I represent IT, but I can speak to that view. Comfort levels on how to record WhatsApp versus Bloomberg chat, I think they're equal. There's vendors out there that provide the capability to govern and monitor both channels. WhatsApp, obviously, you have WhatsApp by the business API or WhatsApp by the personal application. Certain vendors go down different routes. There's limitations on both, but ultimately, you're recording everything that's available on the application. So in terms of governance and any residual risk of not being able to record something, no, that's not an issue.
So one of the things that compliance technology has been doing for a very long time is obviously capturing and recording all of this information that's happening on a broking or trading floor for record keeping. And 30, 40 years ago, when TP ICAP started, ICAP, whichever part of it was originally born as separate companies, when they started to record stuff for regulatory purposes, they probably never had in mind the state of technology and AI where we are today, where you could use some of that data to feed into fine-tuned models, and there's a big trend of people trying to capture as much data as possible. Is that an area where you're seeing as a kind of an additional benefit of data that you're sitting on from a compliance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, and I won't necessarily talk about what we're doing here at TP ICAP, but I think if you talk to generally anybody in the space, there's a lot of opportunity to take data into other use cases. So it could be a risk use case to better monitor your enterprise risk. It could be front office use case to identify trends and what's happening in the markets. It could be for compliance to do, for example, profiling of traders or brokers. More specifically, you can start to see communication omni-channels across individuals inside the organization or externally. So yeah, that data is there to be used for other use cases, and those that have the capacity, the resources, and the budget to start playing in the playground and building out other use cases, it's absolutely an opportunity. And you know, if you talk to anyone on the street, there's plenty of use cases being developed right now.
And to finish off, you mentioned there's a lot of, in terms of trends, there's a lot of things happening around transcription at the moment. Where do you see any other trends kind of forming over the next kind of 1 to 2 years, which are kind of hot areas that you as a person from compliance technology are excited about?
Yeah, I think not to be cliche here, but I think the AI use cases are still evolving in terms of how you use AI to support any of the current reg tech or compliance workflows. I was just on a call with a vendor who was pitching using AI to help with a chatbot for policies, for example. So I think that's evolving. Other things, I think being more prescriptive on targeted surveillance, as an example. So rather than just having generic trade surveillance or comm surveillance platforms that look at generic policies, it's how do you target specific individuals or desks and how they behave. I think that's using not just standard data like communication and trade and order data, but anything from HR data to policies, training, expense reports, things like that. So I think that's evolving as well, of how you can start to be more targeted with surveillance. AML is hot. Everyone's looking at that, the payments game, and looking at patterns and how you dip into broader databases to be able to identify the darker grayer areas that you probably couldn't get out of the box from some of the existing databases that are available. Biometrics is another one. So being able to associate people's voices to a call, that's not easily done with just transcription, but speaker diarization is important. That also helps with enhanced monitoring and association of who's talking. I'll stop there. There's probably 10 more things I could say, but in the interest of time.
Right, Eren Erman, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, thanks, Matt, for having me. Always a pleasure.